The rain had not stopped for 3 days in the small town of Merrow Creek, and the streets were empty and dark, and the only sound anyone could hear was the constant drumming of water against the tin roofs of old buildings that lined the main road like tired soldiers standing in a row. Detective Lena Cross sat inside her car and stared at the house at the end of Birch Lane, and it was a house she had driven past 100 times before, but tonight it looked different, and tonight it looked like it was hiding something, and she could feel it deep in her bones the way a sailor feels a storm before the clouds even appear. She had received a phone call at exactly 11 minutes past midnight, and the voice on the other end had been calm and cold, and it had said only 6 words before the line went dead, and those 6 words were "Thomas Vale has vanished again." And then there was nothing but silence. Thomas Vale was not a man that most people in Merrow Creek liked to talk about, and he was not the kind of man who showed up at church on Sundays, or waved to his neighbors or brought pies to the annual town fair. And in fact, most people in Merrow Creek pretended that Thomas Vale did not exist at all, and that was because Thomas Vale had a past, and it was the kind of past that made people lock their doors and check their windows twice before going to bed. 7 years ago, Thomas Vale had been accused of murdering his wife Clara, and the whole town had watched the trial on television, and they had whispered in grocery stores and barbershops, and they had all believed that he was guilty, and the evidence had seemed strong, and the prosecutor had painted a picture of a jealous and violent man who had snapped one cold evening in December, and had done something terrible and unforgivable. But then something strange had happened, and the jury had come back with a verdict of not guilty, and the courtroom had erupted in shock and anger, and people had screamed and cried, and Thomas Vale had walked out of that courthouse a free man. But he had never truly been free, because the town had already made up its mind. And in Merrow Creek, a not guilty verdict meant nothing when everyone had already decided the truth for themselves. After the trial, Thomas had moved into the old house on Birch Lane, and he had boarded up the windows, and he had stopped going into town, and he had become a ghost, and the only person who ever saw him was the delivery driver who brought groceries to his door every Tuesday morning, and even that driver never saw his face because Thomas always left the money in an envelope, taped to the mailbox, and the groceries were always taken inside after the truck had pulled away. Lena had been a young officer during the trial, and she had studied every piece of evidence, and she had read every witness statement, and unlike the rest of the town, she had never been sure about Thomas Vale, and there had been something about the case that had never sat right with her, and it was like a puzzle with one piece missing, and no matter how many times she tried to complete it, she could never find that last piece. And now Thomas Vale had vanished, and the word again in that phone call bothered her more than anything, because it suggested that this had happened before, and she had not known about it, and that meant someone in this town knew things that she did not, and that was a dangerous thing in a place like Merrow Creek. She stepped out of the car, and the rain hit her face like tiny cold needles, and she pulled her coat tighter around her body and walked toward the house, and the front gate was open, and it swung back and forth in the wind, making a sound like a crying child, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and wild grass that reached up to her knees, and she pushed through it until she reached the front porch. The door was open, and not just unlocked but wide open, as if someone had left in a hurry or as if someone had been taken, and she pulled out her flashlight and clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness like a knife through black cloth, and she stepped inside. The smell hit her first, and it was not the smell of death which she had encountered many times before in her career, but it was the smell of something old and forgotten, like a library that had been sealed for 100 years, and the air was thick and heavy, and it made her chest feel tight. The hallway was narrow and lined with photographs, and she moved her flashlight across them one by one, and they were all pictures of the same woman, and she recognized her immediately, and it was Clara Vale, and in every single photograph Clara was smiling, and her eyes were bright and alive, and it made Lena feel a sadness that she had not expected. She moved deeper into the house, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. And she reached the living room and stopped, and her flashlight landed on something that made her breath catch in her throat. On the wall above the fireplace, someone had written 3 words in red paint, and the words were he, REMEMBRS everything. And the paint was still wet, and it dripped down the wall like blood running from a wound, and Lena stood there for a long time just staring at those words, and trying to understand what they meant, and who had written them, and whether Thomas Vale had written them himself before he disappeared, or whether someone else had come into this house and left a message. She pulled out her phone and called the station, and when the night officer answered, she told him to send a forensic team to Birch Lane immediately, and he asked her what was going on, and she said she was not sure yet, but something bad had happened here, and she could feel it the way you feel eyes watching you from a dark room. While she waited, she walked through the rest of the house, and every room told a story, and the kitchen had dishes stacked neatly in the cupboards, and a single cup of coffee sat on the table, and it was still warm, and that meant that whoever had been here very recently, and that thought made her skin crawl because it meant she might have just missed them. In the bedroom, she found something that changed everything, and it was a notebook hidden under the mattress, and it was thick and filled with handwriting, and she opened it to the first page, and the words she read made her hands tremble, and they said, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth about Clara is not what anyone thinks, and the person who killed her is still in this town, and they are closer than you could ever imagine." Lena closed the notebook and held it against her chest, and she looked around the dark room, and she realized that this was no longer just a missing person case, and this was something much bigger and much more dangerous, and she had just stepped into the middle of it, and there was no turning back now. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness of Merrow Creek, someone was watching and waiting, and they knew that the detective had found the notebook, and they knew that the game had just changed, and a clock had started ticking, and nobody knew how much time was left before everything came crashing down like a house built on lies and secrets and shadows. Lena did not sleep that night, and she sat at her desk in the police station, with the notebook open in front of her, and the pages were yellowed and wrinkled as if they had been written over many months or perhaps even years, and the handwriting was small and tight, and sometimes it was steady, and sometimes it shook as if the person writing had been afraid or angry or both. The notebook was not a diary in the traditional sense, and it did not begin with dates or greetings, and instead it began with a list of names, and there were 7 names written in a column. And beside each name there was a single word or phrase, and Lena read them slowly and carefully. The first name was Gerald Fink, and beside it was written, "The Witness." And Lena knew that name because Gerald Fink had been the key witness in the trial against Thomas Vale, and he had testified that he had seen Thomas standing over Clara's body on the night she died, and his testimony had been the strongest piece of evidence the prosecution had. And yet somehow the jury had still found Thomas not guilty. The second name was Mayor Harold Dunn, and beside it was written, "The Liar." And that made Lena's stomach tighten because Harold Dunn was not just the mayor of Merrow Creek, but he was also one of the most powerful and respected men in the entire county. And he had been mayor for 15 years, and nobody ever ran against him because nobody dared to challenge a man with that much influence. The third name was Dr. Peter Marsh, and beside it was written, "The Doctor Who Saw Too Much." And Lena recognized that name too because Dr. Marsh had been the one who had examined Clara's body and had written the official cause of death, and his report had stated that Clara had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and that the injuries were consistent with a violent attack. The fourth name was Rebecca Stone, and beside it was written, "The Friend Who Lied." And Lena did not recognize this name at first, but then she remembered that Rebecca Stone had been Clara's best friend, and she had testified during the trial that Clara had been afraid of Thomas, and that Clara had told her many times that Thomas had a terrible temper, and that she feared for her life. The fifth name was Officer Dean Harlow, and beside it was written, the first on the scene. And Lena felt a chill run through her body because Dean Harlow was not just any officer, and he was her partner. And he had been her partner for the past 4 years. And he had never once mentioned that he had been the first officer to arrive at the Vale house on the night Clara died. The sixth name was Judge Arthur Crane, and beside it was written, the one who controlled the courtroom. And Judge Crane had presided over the trial, and Lena remembered that he had made several unusual rulings during the case, and some evidence had been excluded, and some witnesses had not been allowed to testify. And at the time people had complained, but nobody had questioned the judge directly, because in a small town like Merrow Creek, you did not question a judge. The seventh and final name made Lena stop breathing for a moment, and it was her own name, and beside it was written, the only one who might believe the truth. And she stared at those words for a long time, and she felt something heavy settle in her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. She turned the page, and Thomas Vale's words continued, and he wrote that on the night Clara died, he had not been home, and he had been at a bar 2 towns over, and he had been drinking alone, and he had receipts, and the bartender could confirm this. But none of that evidence had been presented at trial, because his lawyer had been incompetent, or perhaps his lawyer had been paid to be incompetent, and Thomas had never been able to prove which one it was. He wrote that, when he came home that night, he had found Clara on the kitchen floor, and there had been blood everywhere, and he had screamed, and he had dropped to his knees, and he had held her. And that was when Gerald Fink had appeared at the back door and had seen him covered in blood, and holding his dead wife, and Gerald had run and called the police. And by the time they arrived, the story had already been written, and Thomas was the villain. But Thomas wrote that he had noticed something that night that nobody else had noticed, or that nobody else had wanted to notice. And it was a small detail, but it was the kind of detail that could change everything, and it was a pair of shoes, and they were expensive leather shoes, and they were sitting by the back door, and they did not belong to Thomas, and they did not belong to Clara, and they belonged to someone who had been in that house before Thomas came home. He had told the police about the shoes, but when he was taken to the station and questioned, the shoes were never mentioned again. And when he asked about them, he was told that no shoes had been found at the scene, and they had simply disappeared as if they had never existed, and Thomas knew then that someone in the police department had made those shoes vanish, and that someone was protecting the real killer. Lena leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes, and the station was quiet, and the clock on the wall showed 4 in the morning, and the rain was still falling outside, and she could hear it tapping against the windows like fingers trying to get in. She thought about her partner Dean Harlow, and how he had never mentioned being first on the scene, and she thought about all the times they had driven past the Vale house, and Dean had never said a word, and she wondered what else Dean had not told her, and whether she could trust him at all. She turned more pages, and Thomas described how after the trial he had tried to investigate on his own, and he had watched the people on his list, and he had followed them, and he had taken notes, and he had discovered things that terrified him. He had discovered that Mayor Harold Dunn and Clara had been having an affair, and that it had been going on for over a year before her death, and that Harold had visited the Vale house many times when Thomas was away, and that several people in town knew about it, but nobody had said anything because Harold Dunn was the mayor, and you did not cross the mayor in Merrow Creek. He had discovered that Dr. Peter Marsh had changed his initial findings, and that the first draft of his medical report had stated that the injuries on Clara's body were not consistent with a single attacker, but with 2 attackers, and that the bruising patterns suggested that Clara had been held down by one person, while another person struck her, and this was a detail that had never made it into the final report. He had discovered that Rebecca Stone had not been Clara's friend at all, and that Rebecca had also been involved with Harold Dunn, and that Rebecca had been jealous of Clara, and that her testimony about Thomas being violent had been a complete fabrication, designed to ensure that Thomas would be convicted, and that the real killer would never be found. Lena felt sick, and the words on the pages were pulling her into a world she had not known existed, and it was a world that had been hiding in plain sight in her own town, and she had walked through it every day without seeing it. She reached the final pages of the notebook, and Thomas had written something that made everything more urgent, and he had written that he believed someone had found out about his investigation, and that he had been receiving threats, and that dead animals had been left on his doorstep, and that someone had broken into his house twice, and that he believed they would come for him soon, and that if they did he would not be able to fight them because they were too powerful and too connected. The last entry in the notebook was dated 3 days ago, and it said simply, "They are coming, and I have hidden the proof in the only place they would never look. And if Lena Cross is reading this, then I beg her to find it before they destroy it, because it is the only thing that can bring justice for Clara, and the only thing that can save what is left of this broken town." Lena closed the notebook and stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark, wet streets of Marrow Creek, and everything she thought she knew about this place had just been shattered, and she was standing in the ruins of it trying to figure out which direction to move, and every direction felt dangerous. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she walked over and picked it up, and there was a text message from an unknown number, and it contained only 4 words, and those words were "Stop reading the notebook." And Lena stared at the screen and realized that whoever had sent this message knew exactly where she was and exactly what she was doing, and that meant she was already being watched, and the danger was no longer something distant and abstract, but something immediate and real and breathing down her neck. The next morning Lena drove to the home of Gerald Fink, and he lived on the outskirts of Marrow Creek in a small farmhouse surrounded by dead cornfields, and the sky was gray and heavy, and the rain had finally stopped, but the clouds looked like they were just resting and could open up again at any moment. Gerald Fink was a thin man in his 60s with hollow cheeks and nervous eyes, and when he opened the door and saw Lena standing there with her badge, he immediately tried to close it again, but she put her foot in the gap and said she just wanted to talk, and that it would be better for everyone if he cooperated. He let her in, and the house smelled like cigarette smoke and old newspapers, and there were stacks of magazines and mail piled on every surface, and the television was on but the sound was turned down, and a news anchor was silently mouthing words that nobody in the room could hear. Lena sat across from Gerald at his kitchen table, and she placed the notebook on the table between them, and Gerald looked at it, and his face went pale, and the color drained from his skin so quickly that Lena thought he might faint, and he asked her where she had gotten that, and she told him she had found it in Thomas Vale's house, and Gerald closed his eyes and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. She asked him about the night Clara died, and she asked him to tell her exactly what he saw, and Gerald began to repeat the same story he had told at the trial, and he said he had been walking past the Vale house, and he had heard screaming, and he had looked through the back door, and had seen Thomas standing over Clara's body. But Lena stopped him, and she said she did not want the story he had told at the trial, and she wanted the real story, and she wanted the truth, and Gerald opened his mouth and then closed it and then opened it again, and his hands were shaking, and he picked up a glass of water from the table, but his fingers trembled so badly that water spilled onto the wood. He said he could not tell her the truth, and she asked why, and he said because they would kill him, and she asked who would kill him, and he shook his head, and said she had no idea what she was getting into, and that the people behind this were not the kind of people who made empty threats, and that they had proven what they were capable of, and Clara Vale was the proof. Lena leaned forward and she spoke softly, and she told Gerald that Thomas Vale was missing, and that there was a message written on his wall in red paint, and that whoever had taken Thomas might come for Gerald next, and that the safest thing Gerald could do right now was tell the truth, because the truth was the only weapon they had left. Gerald stared at her for a long time, and then something in his eyes changed, and it was like a wall crumbling, and behind it was years of guilt and fear and exhaustion, and he began to talk, and once he started he could not stop. He said that on the night Clara died, he had not been walking past the Vale house at all, and that he had been called to the house by someone, and that person had told him to go to the back door at exactly 9 o'clock, and to look inside, and to remember what he saw, and then to call the police, and tell them exactly what he was told to say. He said the person who had called him was Officer Dean Harlow, and Lena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as if the entire world had tilted sideways, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Gerald said that Dean had told him that Thomas had killed Clara, and that Dean needed a witness, and that Gerald owed Dean a favor from years ago, and that Dean had made it very clear that refusing was not an option, and so Gerald had gone to the house, and he had looked through the back door, and he had seen Thomas on his knees holding Clara and covered in blood, and it had looked exactly like what Dean had said it would look like, and Gerald had called the police and told them the story Dean had given him. But Gerald said there was something else, and something he had never told anyone, and it was that, when he had arrived at the house a few minutes before 9 o'clock, he had hidden in the bushes and waited, and while he was waiting, he had seen two men leave through the front door, and they had been walking quickly, and one of them had been wiping his hands on a cloth, and the other had been carrying a pair of shoes, and even in the darkness Gerald had recognized one of them, and it was Mayor Harold Dunn. Lena asked about the second man, and Gerald said he had not been able to see the second man's face clearly, but he had been tall and thin, and he had moved like someone who was used to giving orders, and Gerald had always believed it was Judge Arthur Crane, but he could not be certain. Lena sat in silence for a moment, and the pieces were coming together, and they were forming a picture that was more horrifying than she had imagined. And it was a picture of powerful men who had murdered a woman, and then framed her husband, and had used the police and the courts and the entire town to cover it up. She asked Gerald why he had never come forward, and Gerald laughed, but it was not a real laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that comes out when a person has nothing left. And he said that 2 weeks after the trial, a man had come to his house in the middle of the night, and had put a gun to his head, and had told him that if he ever changed his story, he would end up like Clara and Gerald had believed him. And for 7 years he had lived with the guilt and the fear, and it had eaten him alive from the inside. Lena asked him if he would be willing to make an official statement, and Gerald hesitated, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes, and it was the war between the desire to finally tell the truth and the terror of what might happen if he did. And after a long silence he nodded, and said he was tired of being afraid, and that living like this was not really living at all. She drove Gerald to the station, and she took his statement in the interview room, and she recorded every word, and when it was done, she locked the recording in her personal safe, and not in the evidence room, because she no longer trusted anyone in the department, and especially not Dean Harlow. She drove back to her desk and sat down and tried to think about her next move, and she needed to find Thomas Vale, because he was either in hiding or he had been taken, and either way he was the key to everything. And without him, the case would be difficult to build because notebooks and witness statements could be dismissed, but a living, breathing person telling their story in court was something that could not be easily destroyed. Her phone rang, and it was Dr. Peter Marsh, and his voice was shaking, and he said he needed to see her right away, and that it was urgent, and that he could not talk on the phone, and she asked where he wanted to meet, and he said the old church on Miller Road, and that she should come alone, and she should come now. She drove to the church, and it was a building that had been abandoned for years, and the windows were broken, and the roof had caved in on one side, and weeds grew through the cracks in the floor, and it was the kind of place that children dared each other to enter, and the kind of place that held shadows even in the middle of the day. Dr. Marsh was sitting in one of the remaining pews, and he looked terrible, and his hair was uncombed, and his clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like a man who had not slept in days. He told Lena that someone had broken into his office last night and had stolen files, and that the files were related to the Clara Vale case, and that they contained his original medical report, and the one that showed 2 attackers and not one, and he said that he had kept a copy hidden all these years, because he had known that someday someone would come looking for the truth, and he had wanted to be ready. But now the copy was gone and he was frightened, and he said he had received a phone call that morning from a voice he did not recognize, and the voice had told him to leave Marrow Creek and never come back, and he wanted to know what Lena was going to do about it, because things were falling apart, and the people who had kept this secret for 7 years were getting desperate, and desperate people were the most dangerous kind. Lena told him about the notebook and about Gerald Fink's statement, and Dr. Marsh listened, and his eyes grew wider with every word, and when she finished he sat in silence for a long time, and then he said something that sent a wave of cold through her entire body. He said, "You need to find Thomas Vale before they do, because if they find him first they will kill him, and they will bury him somewhere nobody will ever look, and the truth will die with him. And this town will go on pretending that everything is fine, and the monsters will keep wearing their masks, and nobody will ever know what really happened to Clara." Lena looked at the broken windows of the old church and the gray light that came through them, and she knew that Dr. Marsh was right, and that time was running out, and that somewhere in or near Marrow Creek Thomas Vale was waiting and hoping that someone would find him before the darkness closed in for good. Lena knew she had to move carefully because one wrong step could get her killed, or worse, could get Thomas Vale killed. And so she spent the next several hours thinking about the last entry in the notebook, where Thomas had written that he had hidden the proof in the only place they would never look, and she turned that sentence over and over in her mind like a coin between her fingers. She thought about Thomas Vale and who he was and what he cared about, and she thought about the photographs on the walls of his house, and every single one of them had been a picture of Clara, and that told her something important, and it told her that despite everything that had happened, Thomas had loved his wife, and that his love had not died when she did, and it had continued to burn in that dark, boarded-up house like a candle that refused to go out. And then it hit her, and it was so obvious that she almost laughed, and she grabbed her keys and ran to her car and started driving, and the place they would never look was the one place connected to Clara that everyone had forgotten about, and it was Clara's grave. Clara Vale had been buried in the old cemetery on the hill outside of town, and it was a quiet place surrounded by oak trees and iron fences, and most people in Marrow Creek avoided it because the road leading up to it was narrow and winding, and the cemetery itself had a reputation for being haunted, which was the kind of thing that kept curious people away. Lena parked her car at the bottom of the hill and walked up the path, and the ground was soft and muddy from the rain, and her boots sank into the earth with every step, and she could hear birds calling from the trees, but other than that the world was silent. She found Clara's grave near the back of the cemetery, and it was a simple stone with her name and the dates of her birth and death, and someone had placed fresh flowers on it, and the flowers were white lilies, and they were not wilted, which meant someone had been here very recently, and Lena knew it had been Thomas. She looked around the grave, and at first she did not see anything unusual, but then she noticed that the ground on the right side of the headstone looked different from the rest, and it was slightly raised, and the grass had been disturbed, and she knelt down and began to dig with her hands, and the soil was loose and easy to move, and after a few minutes her fingers touched something hard and she pulled it out, and it was a metal box about the size of a shoebox, and it was sealed with tape, and when she shook it she could hear things moving inside. She opened the box, and inside were 3 items, and the first was a USB drive, and the second was a sealed envelope, and the third was a photograph, and the photograph showed 2 men standing outside the Vale house, and one of them was Mayor Harold Dunn, and the other was indeed Judge Arthur Crane, and they were both smiling, and behind them through the kitchen window you could see the shape of a woman lying on the floor, and the timestamp on the photograph showed the date and time of Clara's murder. Lena's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the photograph, and she realized that Thomas had somehow obtained photographic evidence placing both men at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder. And this was not circumstantial evidence, and this was not hearsay, and this was proof, and it was the kind of proof that could send powerful men to prison for the rest of their lives. She opened the envelope, and inside was a letter written by Thomas and addressed to her, and it said that the photograph had been taken by a security camera that Thomas had installed on the outside of his house, without telling anyone, and that the camera had been hidden in a birdhouse near the front porch, and that he had not known about the recording until weeks after the trial when he had finally thought to check it. He wrote that the USB drive contained the full video footage from that night, and that it showed Harold Dunn and Arthur Crane arriving at the house and entering through the front door, and that it showed them leaving 45 minutes later, and that it showed Dean Harlow arriving shortly after and placing a call on his phone, and that it showed Gerald Fink arriving and looking through the back door, and then it showed Thomas himself arriving home and finding Clara on the floor. He wrote that he had kept this evidence hidden because he knew that if he tried to take it to the police it would be destroyed, and that Dean Harlow controlled the evidence room, and that Judge Crane controlled the courts, and that Harold Dunn controlled everything else, and there was nobody in Merrow Creek he could trust except one person, and that person was Lena Cross, because she was the only officer who had ever expressed doubt about his guilt, and because she was the only person in this town who seemed to care more about the truth and about power. Lena put everything back in the box and held it close to her chest, and she stood up and looked around the cemetery, and the trees swayed in the wind and the shadows moved between the headstones, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, but when she looked again, there was nothing there. She walked quickly back to her car and drove straight to her apartment, and she did not go to the station, because the station was not safe and Dean Harlow could be there, and she needed time to think and plan her next move. She plugged the USB drive into her personal laptop and watched the footage, and it was exactly as Thomas had described, and the video was grainy but clear enough to identify the faces, and it showed everything, and it showed Harold Dunn and Arthur Crane walking up to the front door, and it showed them going inside, and it showed the lights in the kitchen turning on, and then 42 minutes later, it showed them leaving and Dunn was wiping his hands and Crane was carrying the leather shoes, and they got into a dark car and drove away. 12 minutes later, Dean Harlow arrived in his patrol car and he walked around the house and he made a phone call, and then he left, and 9 minutes after that Gerald Fink appeared and walked to the back door and looked inside and then pulled out his phone and called the police. And then finally Thomas Vale arrived and he parked his car in the driveway and walked to the front door and went inside, and moments later the kitchen light came on again, and through the window you could see Thomas drop to his knees. Lena watched the footage 3 times, and each time she felt the anger growing inside her, and it was a deep burning anger that started in her stomach and spread outward like fire through dry grass, and she thought about Thomas Vale, who had spent 7 years alone in a dark house, while the men who killed his wife walked freely through the streets of Merrow Creek and smiled and shook hands and gave speeches about justice and community. She made copies of everything, and she put 1 copy in a safe deposit box at the bank in the next town over, and she mailed another copy to a journalist she knew in the city, and she kept the original with her, because she was not going to let this evidence disappear the way the shoes had disappeared, and the way the medical report had disappeared, and the way Thomas Vale himself had disappeared. But she still needed to find Thomas, and she still did not know if he was alive or dead, and she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the notebook again and reread every page looking for any clue she might have missed. And then she found it, and it was hidden in the margins of one of the pages, and it was written so small that she had to use a magnifying glass to read it, and it said, "The cabin on Raven Lake where Clara and I spent our first anniversary, and where I will go if I ever need to disappear." And Lena knew Raven Lake because it was about 40 miles north of Merrow Creek, and it was remote and surrounded by forest, and it was exactly the kind of place where a man could hide. She grabbed her coat and her gun and her keys, and she was about to walk out the door when she heard a knock, and she stopped and looked through the peephole, and standing on the other side of her door was Dean Harlow, and he was not smiling, and his hand was resting on his holster, and Lena felt her heart begin to pound like a drum. She took a breath and opened the door, and Dean looked at her and said he had heard she had been asking questions about the Vale case, and that people were talking, and that he wanted to know what she had found, and his voice was calm, but his eyes were not calm, and his eyes were cold and sharp like the edge of a blade. Lena looked at her partner and the man she had trusted for 4 years, and she smiled and said she had found nothing, and that the house had been empty, and that Thomas Vale had probably just wandered off the way troubled men sometimes do, and Dean stared at her for a long moment, and she could feel him searching her face for any sign of a lie, and she kept her expression neutral and steady. And after what felt like an eternity, Dean nodded and said to let him know if anything turned up, and then he turned and walked away. Lena closed the door and leaned against it and let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and she waited until she heard his car pull away. And then she grabbed everything she needed and went out the back door and got in her car and drove north toward Raven Lake, and the cabin where she hoped Thomas Vale was still alive and still waiting for someone brave enough to find him. The road to Raven Lake was long and dark, and it wound through thick forest that blocked out whatever light was left in the sky, and the headlights of Lena's car cut through the darkness, and the trees on either side of the road leaned inward like tall figures whispering to each other, and she gripped the steering wheel tightly and kept her eyes on the road. She had driven for about 30 minutes when she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror, and they had appeared suddenly, as if a car had been waiting on a side road and had pulled out behind her, and the headlights stayed at a constant distance, and did not come closer and did not fall back, and Lena felt a knot form in her stomach because she knew she was being followed. She pressed the accelerator and drove faster, and the car behind her matched her speed, and the trees flew past in a blur, and the road twisted and turned, and she had to focus hard to keep the car on the asphalt, and she thought about pulling over and confronting whoever was behind her, but she decided against it, because she did not know how many people were in that car, and she did not know if they were armed, and she could not risk a confrontation when she was this close to finding Thomas. After another 10 minutes, the road opened up, and she could see the lake ahead, and it was a wide, dark body of water that reflected the clouds above like a giant mirror. And on the far shore, she could see the outline of a small cabin, and there was a faint light in the window, and her heart leaped, because that light meant someone was inside, and that someone could be Thomas Vale. She parked her car near the shore and got out, and the air was cold and damp and smelled like pine and wet earth, and she looked back, and the headlights that had been following her had stopped about a quarter-mile back, and they were just sitting there idling and watching, and she knew she did not have much time. She ran along the shore toward the cabin, and her boots splashed through shallow water and mud, and she could hear her own breathing loud and fast. And when she reached the cabin, she banged on the door and called out Thomas Vale's name. And for a moment there was nothing but silence, and then she heard movement inside, and the door opened slowly. Thomas Vale stood in the doorway, and he looked nothing like the photographs Lena had seen, and he was thin and pale, and his beard was long, and his eyes were red and tired, but they were also alert and sharp. And when he saw Lena's badge, his shoulders dropped, and he stepped aside and let her in. The cabin was small and simple, with one room that served as a bedroom and a living room and a kitchen all at once, and there was a fire burning in a stone fireplace, and the light from it danced across the walls, and Thomas sat down in a chair near the fire and looked at Lena and asked her if she had found the box, and she said yes, and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in what looked like years his body relaxed. He told her everything, and he told her how he had spent 7 years gathering evidence piece by piece, and how he had watched the men who killed his wife live their lives in comfort and luxury, while he rotted in a house of grief, and how it had taken every ounce of strength he had not to give up and not to let the darkness swallow him whole. He told her that 3 days ago he had received a visit from Dean Harlow, and that Dean had come to his house and had told him that people knew about his investigation, and that if Thomas did not stop and destroy everything he had gathered, then Thomas would disappear and nobody would ever find him, and Thomas had known that Dean was not bluffing. And so he had written the final entry in his notebook, and he had buried the box at Clara's grave, and he had painted the message on the wall because he wanted whoever found it to know that the truth still existed somewhere. And then he had come to the cabin because it was the only place left where he felt safe, and it was the place where Clara had been happiest, and where they had spent their first anniversary, and where she had danced in the kitchen while he played music on an old radio, and where they had sat on the porch and watched the sunset over the lake and talked about the future they would never get to have. Lena listened, and she felt the weight of his words and the weight of his suffering, and she told him that she had copies of the evidence in safe places, and that she had sent a copy to a journalist, and that she had Gerald Fink's recorded statement, and that the truth was no longer something that could be buried or burned or hidden in an evidence room. Thomas looked at her, and there were tears in his eyes, and he asked her why she had believed him when nobody else had, and Lena thought about it, and said that she had not believed him at first, and that she had only felt that something was wrong, and that sometimes the truth does not announce itself with trumpets and fireworks, and sometimes it just sits quietly in the corner waiting for someone to notice it. And then they both heard it, and it was the sound of car doors closing outside, and Lena went to the window and looked out, and she saw 3 figures walking toward the cabin, and one of them was Dean Harlow, and one of them was Mayor Harold Dunn, and the third was a tall, thin man. She could not see clearly, but she knew in her gut that it was Judge Arthur Crane. She turned to Thomas and told him to stay inside and to lock the door behind her, and Thomas grabbed her arm and said she could not go out there alone, and she looked at him and said she was not alone, and she held up her phone and showed him that it was recording and that it was connected to a live stream, and that the journalist she had contacted was watching in real time, and that everything that happened from this moment forward would be seen and documented and could never be denied or erased. She stepped out of the cabin, and the 3 men stopped, and they stood about 20 feet away, and the lake was behind them, and the moonlight had broken through the clouds, and it cast a pale silver glow over everything, and the scene looked like something from a painting, and a dark and terrible painting. Dean Harlow spoke first, and he said that Lena had made a mistake, and that she should have left this alone, and that some things were better left buried. And Lena looked at the man who had been her partner, and she felt a sadness that was deeper than anger because she had trusted him, and he had been lying to her face every single day for 4 years. Harold Dunn stepped forward, and he was a big man with broad shoulders, and a face that people in Marrow Creek had trusted for 15 years, and he said that nobody would believe a washed-up drunk like Thomas Vale and a notebook full of ramblings, and that the town would side with its mayor the way it always had and the way it always would. And then the third man spoke, and it was Judge Arthur Crane, and his voice was thin and sharp, and he said that this was over and that they should all go home and forget this ever happened, and that it would be better for everyone, especially for Lena. But Lena did not move, and she held up the metal box, and she said she had the video footage from the night Clara was killed, and she said it showed everything, and she said it showed 2 men entering the Vale house, and one of them wiping blood from his hands and the other carrying a pair of leather shoes, and she said the footage had been sent to a journalist, and to the state police, and to the FBI, and that it was no longer something that could be destroyed because it was already out there in the world, and it would never go away. The 3 men stood in silence, and the moonlight made their faces look like masks, and for the first time Lena could see fear in their eyes, and it was a fear she recognized, because it was the same fear that Gerald Fink had shown, and the same fear that Thomas Vale had lived with for 7 years, and it was the fear of being caught, and the fear of losing everything. Harold Dunn took a step forward, and Lena put her hand on her gun and said that if he took one more step she would defend herself, and that the live stream was still running, and that the whole world was watching. And Harold stopped, and his face twisted with rage, but he did not move. Sirens broke the silence, and they came from the road, and red and blue lights flickered through the trees, and Lena had called the state police before she had left her apartment, because she had known that the local police could not be trusted, and she had asked for backup at Raven Lake, and they had come. Within minutes, the clearing around the cabin was filled with officers, and Dean Harlow and Harold Dunn and Arthur Crane were put in handcuffs and led to separate vehicles. And as they were taken away, Dunn turned and looked at Lena, and his eyes were empty and cold. And he said nothing, and she said nothing, and there was nothing left to say. Thomas Vale stepped out of the cabin and stood beside Lena, and they watched the cars drive away, and the lights disappeared down the road, and the silence returned, and the lake was still, and the moon hung above them like a witness to everything that had just happened. Thomas looked at the cabin, and then at the lake, and then at the sky, and he said that Clara would have liked Lena, and that Clara had always believed that good people existed even in the darkest places. And Lena looked at him and said she was sorry that it had taken so long, and Thomas shook his head and said that it did not matter how long it had taken because the truth had survived, and that was the only thing that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened in Merrow Creek spread across the country, and the journalist published everything. And the video footage was shown on every news channel, and Gerald Fink testified before a grand jury, and Dr. Peter M. Arsh came forward with a sworn statement about the altered medical report, and Rebecca Stone confessed that her testimony had been a lie, and that she had been threatened into giving it. Harold Dunn and Arthur Crane were charged with the murder of Clara Vale, and Dean Harlow was charged as an accessory, and with obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, and all three men were denied bail, and the trial was held in the state capitol, because no court in Merrow Creek could be trusted to be impartial. Thomas Vale sat in the courtroom every day, and he watched the men who had killed his wife finally face justice, and when the guilty verdicts were read, he did not cheer, and he did not cry, and he simply nodded and looked down at his hands and whispered something that only he could hear, and those who were sitting close thought it sounded like a name. After the trial, Thomas returned to Raven Lake, and he moved into the cabin permanently, and he took down the boards from the windows of the old house on Birch Lane and sold it, and the money went to a charity for victims of wrongful accusations, and he lived quietly by the water, and every evening he sat on the porch and watched the sunset, and sometimes he played music on an old radio and danced alone in the kitchen the way he and Clara used to. Lena Cross was promoted to chief of police in Merrow Creek, and she spent her first year rebuilding the department from the ground up, and she hired people she could trust, and she created a system where evidence could never be tampered with again, and she made sure that the people of Merrow Creek could have faith in their police force and in their town. She visited Thomas at the cabin once a month, and they would sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about Clara, and about the case, and about life, and about how strange it was that the truth could be buried for so long but could never truly die, and that it always found its way to the surface, eventually like a seed pushing through concrete. And sometimes when the wind blew across Raven Lake and the water rippled in the moonlight, Lena would think about that first night when she had stood in the dark hallway of the Vale house and read the words on the wall, and she would remember how it had all begun with a phone call at 11 minutes past midnight, and 6 words spoken by a voice she never identified, and those words had started everything, and those words had been, "Thomas Vale has vanished again." She never found out who made that call, and it remained the one piece of the puzzle she could never place, and sometimes she wondered if it had been Thomas himself reaching out one last time before he ran, and sometimes she wondered if it had been the ghost of Clara guiding her toward the truth, and sometimes she decided it did not matter because whoever it was had changed everything, and had set the whole story in motion like a single match, lighting a fire that burned through the lies and the fear and the darkness until all that was left was the truth standing alone and unbreakable in the light.